Hi, it's Delina with Arizona Desert Gems, and today I'm going to take you along as I make these cute little square earrings. My inspiration comes from this book, Handcrafted Metal Findings by Denise, Peck, and Jane Dickerson. And I saw this project in there, and I thought it would be really fun to try to make them. Now, I don't have the book, so I'm just going to make them by how I see them and try out some techniques. So stick around to the end and I'll tell you what went right and what went wrong. Using 20 gauge copper sheet, I'm cutting 1/2 inch squares with metal shears. This is a metal file that I got from Harbor Freight. It's just a large file that takes off a lot of metal at one time and quickens up the job. So you want to file each side and make sure that as you're looking at your earrings, you're matching them up to get the best size possible. I decided to make 2 pairs while I was doing this to save time on the process. You'll notice sometimes the file drags on the metal. If that happens, you can just turn your metal over and try from the other side. The other thing you might notice is I'm only filing in one direction. I'm not scrubbing back and forth. That's because files only cut in one direction. And if you go back and forth, it just fills the file with metal shavings. So here I've switched to a smaller file to round the corners because there's more control. I don't want to make them completely round, but I do want to take off the sharp edges because otherwise we end up with tiny little razor blades. And now I'm going to refine the edges even more to make them very smooth. I'm using fine grit sandpaper, 1200 grit in fact. So just go through all of the pieces of earrings, feeling them with your fingers, just to make sure that it's nice and smooth. Now to polish up the surface, I'm using my Foredom rotary tool with a silicone bristle brush that's probably about 220 grit. So we're just going to polish up the surface going in one direction. And I'm not looking for a high mirror finish on this. I'm just wanting to clean it up and get a nice even surface. However you want to finish them, that's up to you. And you can go through all the grits going up to the highest grits up into 1 or 2,000 if you choose. So I did decide to go up to a 400 grit silicone polishing wheel because 220 is pretty coarse and you actually can visibly see the marks. So when you are changing up to the next grit, you want to file in the opposite direction at a 90-degree angle to your first sanding or filing that you've done. You can already see here that it's getting a much shinier finish than before. And now here they are on my steel bench block. I'm going to use a nylon hammer because I just want to hammer them flat. I don't want to change the shape of the metal. I just want to make sure that they're laying flat. So I'm going to hammer each one on the different sides to get the look that I want. Now this is for texturing. On one end it has the little pointed side, but today because we want to put in the lines, we're going to use the sharp linear side of this. It is very sharp and so it doesn't take a lot of hammering to make a mark. If you go very heavy with this and get heavy-handed, you can actually cut through a thin sheet of metal. So here I'm just hammering part way up each side of the square so that it's going to have all 4 sides textured. And do this for each one. So you can see I only textured maybe just a quarter of the way on each side of the square. To make the ear wires, I'm using half-hard 20 gauge copper wire. I buy this in 1-pound spools from Rio Grande. So I was just guessing and I measured out 2 inches for the ear wire using my flush cutters Just going to chop off the 2 inches and measure it against itself. But before I do that, it's important to straighten your wire, which you can easily do just running your hand down it several times. So I'm cutting here 2 ear wires at 2 inches each. I had an idea for the soldering, and so I wanted to file off the ends to make them flat. And I thought if I did this, then I could hammer them into paddles to provide more contact for soldering. To hammer them, I'm getting out my steel bench block again and my chasing hammer, and you're going to see it has a flat surface on one side, and that's the side I'm using. Just gentle tapping and the wire already starts to flatten out in a little paddle. All you need is just a few taps. Now it's time to solder on the ear wires. I'm using aquaflux, and you can either spray it on or paint it on with a brush. This is what's going to help the solder flow, and it's also going to keep the pieces from fire scaling as bad. So I'm using a silversmith torch. It's acetylene gas. You can also use handheld butane torches. The first thing I'm doing is drying up the flux. The dry flux helps the little tiny solder pieces stay put instead of flying all over when you put the torch on them. And now I'm going to be using hard solder. I usually use wire solder, and I hammer it into little flat pieces, and it doesn't take much at all. When you are using solders, make sure you're keeping your solder labeled so that you know if you're using easy, medium, or hard. So just a tiny chip of solder for each one of the earrings. Remember, I'm making 2 sets, and that's why I have 4 squares. So the ear wires are now laid out. The little solder chips are right next to the ear wires, and I'm just gently warming up the area around the copper first to get an even heat, and then going in a little bit more concentrated onto each piece. It doesn't take long at all for it to heat up to a temperature where the solder will flow, since this is such tiny pieces and one little wire. Remember how I said the little solder pieces can move around? So I'm coming in with the soldering pick, moving it onto place, and then pulling the solder onto the other side by moving my torch on the back side of the wire. And now to quench the metal, which simply means putting it in a bowl of cool water to cool the metal off very quickly. You might hear some sizzling sounds, but that's okay. It's not going to hurt you. And now to pickle it, and all that means is we're going to put it in a solution so that it gets all this fire staining off of it. So I'm using copper tongs because if I put steel tongs in my pickle, it will contaminate it. I use vinegar and sea salt for my pickle. There's a little bit of red fire staining still on them, but there's no carbon from the flame. So I'm just drying them off here, and I'm going to be using my Foredom rotary tool to go ahead and sand off the rest of that. The wires are going to be really soft and wiggly because we've now annealed them, which has changed the chemical structure. It's time to clean them up, and I'm using a 400 grit with my Foredom rotary tool. Remember, 400 grit was the grit I left off on, so I'm not changing the surface. I'm just removing that red fire stain. So look how amazingly shiny they came out. We've already polished them, and so now we're just taking off that top layer of oxidation. And you want to get in there nice and tight around your ear wire just to make your piece much more finished. To clean the ear wires, I'm just going to use extra fine steel wool. Again, Harbor Freight is your friend, nice and cheap, lots of different kinds of tools that can be used for jewelry making. You do want to be careful not to breathe in the fibers of steel wool. But just a few passes over the ear wire and it's great. Now, because we don't want to hurt anybody, we want to round off the ends of our ear wires. I keep a cup burr that is made specially for 20 gauge wire in my Dremel tool at all times so that I don't have to be switching back and forth. You can see you just put it up there, let it smooth it off, get all the different edges, and you're done. Now I'm ready to make the bend in the ear wires. So I'm taking my nylon jaw pliers and I'm wanting to make the wire as straight as I can possibly do it. And then by twisting it, I am hardening the wire. Another way to do this would be to hammer the wire on your steel block with a nylon hammer or a rawhide hammer. Now to make the bend in the ear wire, I use part of a Sharpie. Just line it up so that you are always using the exact same point on the Sharpie, and then your ear wires will be uniform. Just checking to make sure it's not too bendable and has some hardness. So there we are, the first earring done. Now let's get to the review. Things that went right, things that could be better. Overall, I'm pretty happy with this. They're a pretty good match. Some things that went right. They were really easy to make. They required a minimum number of tools, and I appreciated being able to use shears rather than a jeweler's saw. Now for some things I would change. I thought that ear wires were way too long, and so I would probably shorten those to about 1.5 inches. Hammering the ear wires flat didn't really help the rolling effect, and in fact it was easier if I didn't hammer them flat, so I would leave them as is. Twisting the ear wires to work hard to them worked, but it did create a twisted look that you might not appreciate. So in that case, I would just hammer them with a nylon jaw hammer on the bench block. If you want to purchase these, I have a few listed in my shop down in the description. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and maybe even try it yourself. As always, happy creating, and like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.